Hello, everyone. My name is Caitlin Moore. I'm 32 years old, and 3 days ago, my own family sat across a polished dining table, smiled politely, and decided, without raising their voices, that I was no longer worth taking seriously. They didn't yell, they didn't argue, they didn't even sound angry. They simply treated me the way they always had, like the failure they assumed I would never outgrow. What they didn't know, what they couldn't imagine, was that within 10 days, the same people who dismissed me over dinner would be staring at the collapse of everything they built, realizing far too late that the daughter they underestimated was the only one who could have saved them. If you've ever been overlooked, talked down to, or quietly erased by people who were supposed to support you, take a second to like this video. Subscribe if stories about quiet power and delayed justice resonate with you. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I read every one. This isn't a story about shouting back. It's a story about staying silent long enough to choose the right moment. My father has always loved order. Order in schedules, order in seating, order in who mattered and who didn't. The monthly family dinner was his favorite ritual every second Thursday, 7 p.m., no exceptions. The house in Bellevue was colonial, immaculate, and designed to impress people who didn't live in it. Inside, everything followed a hierarchy that never needed to be spoken aloud. My mother, Linda, sat to my father's left, always. My brother Jason sat to his right. And I sat at the far end of the table, closest to the kitchen door, the helper's seat. The place reserved for the one who might need to refill a glass, clear a plate, or fetch something forgotten, not the guest of honor. Never the center of attention. I'd been sitting there since I was 17. That night was no different. Jason arrived late, confident as always, wearing the kind of relaxed smile that comes from knowing the room belongs to you. He slid a folder across the table toward my father, Richard Moore, the CEO of Moore Construction Group. "City contract," Jason said casually. 10 million, signed this afternoon. My father's face lit up instantly. That look, pride, approval, ownership, it appeared so rarely for me that I almost didn't recognize it anymore. "That's my son," he said, lifting his glass. "Real work, real impact." He turned his head slightly, just enough to include me without really looking at me. "And Caitlin," he added, "is still doing whatever it is she does." "Investment management," I said quietly. "Right," he replied, already turning back to Jason, moving numbers around on screens. My mother smiled politely, the way she always did when silence was safer than honesty. My phone buzzed in my lap, an email notification. Subject line, "Approval confirmed." I didn't open it. I didn't say anything. What would be the point? In that room, my achievements didn't exist unless they could be explained in concrete, physical terms. Buildings you could point at, cranes you could photograph, contracts you could frame. Jason leaned back in his chair, mirroring my father's posture perfectly. "Maybe one day," he said, smirking, "you'll come back and do something real with us." I looked up at him. "I have a real job." He laughed softly. "Sure, but it's not building anything, is it? Not leaving a legacy." Legacy. That word had weight in our family. It always meant one thing, the company. And by extension, Jason. I excused myself and stepped into the hallway, where a large portrait hung above the sideboard. My grandmother, Eleanor Moore, standing in front of a half-finished construction site from decades ago. She was the only one who ever told me the truth. "Sometimes," she used to say, "the most powerful position is the one nobody sees coming." She'd passed away a month earlier. The family talked about her in polite terms, her age, her health, her timing. But no one talked about what she'd actually built. Eleanor had co-founded Moore Construction Group in the 1960s. She ran the finances for 30 years. She taught me how to read balance sheets before I learned algebra. And she saw me. The rest of them never did. When I returned to the table, dessert was already being served. Conversation had moved on without me, just as it always did. I listened. I nodded. I stayed quiet. Because for 15 years, I'd learned something my family never noticed. They only paid attention when they thought they were winning. And that night, as my father toasted my brother's success, and my mother smiled through another carefully curated dinner, none of them realized they were sitting across from the one person who understood exactly how fragile their confidence really was. They thought I was irrelevant. They thought I was harmless. They thought the helper's seat was where I belonged. And for now, I let them believe it. The call came 3 days later, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. I was at my desk, the windows of my downtown Seattle office framing the skyline in pale winter light, when my phone buzzed with my mother's name. I hesitated before answering. Something in my chest tightened, the way it always did when family crossed into my workday. "Caitlin," she said, breathless. Not warm, not angry. Controlled, but rushed. "We need to talk." "About what?" I asked. There was a pause, just long enough to tell me this conversation had already happened without me. "Your grandmother's will." I leaned back in my chair. "What about it?" "Don't pretend you don't know," she snapped. "James Mitchell just left your father's office. $8 million, Caitlin. $8 million that should have gone into the Moore family trust." So they knew. I looked out at the city below, traffic crawling, people moving through lives that didn't revolve around the same last name. "It was Eleanor's decision," I said calmly. "Your grandmother was 93, my mother replied. "She was on medication, she was confused." "She wasn't confused," I said. "That money belongs to the family business," she continued, ignoring me. "Your father has already scheduled a family meeting. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. Don't even think about missing it." The line went dead. I didn't move for a long time after that. The truth was, I'd known this moment was coming. Eleanor had warned me. Her lawyer had contacted me privately, exactly as she instructed. No announcements, no discussion, no debate. $8 million transferred into a trust under my name alone. For my bravest grandchild, the letter had read, the one who chose her own path. I'd folded that letter and placed it in my desk drawer, reading it more times than I could count, not for the money, but for the validation. In a family that measured worth by proximity to power, Eleanor had seen something different in me. She had seen independence. The accusations started before the sun went down. Jason texted first. "Seriously? You manipulated Grandma into rewriting her will?" Then another. "That money was meant for the company." Then my father. "We need to discuss this like a family. Bring the documentation." By noon the next day, I had 14 missed calls and 6 voicemails, each one more aggressive than the last. My mother cried in one, my father threatened in another. Jason accused me of elder abuse. They used the word senile. They called the woman who built the financial backbone of their empire senile. I pulled Eleanor's letter from my drawer and read the final line again. "They'll come for it, dear one, they always do. But remember, possession isn't ownership, and blood isn't loyalty." She had known exactly what they would say, exactly how they would try to shame me into giving back what she had deliberately kept from them. I checked my calendar. The family meeting was scheduled less than 24 hours after my mother's call. No discussion, no preparation, just compliance. That should have been the first sign. I opened my second monitor and pulled up more construction groups' public filings. Then the private ones I'd been quietly tracking for years. What I saw made everything click into place. The Harbor Point Tower project, Jason's so-called masterpiece, was bleeding money. Change orders piled on top of underestimated costs. Credit lines stretched thin, subcontractors paid late, penalties accumulating quietly in the background. They weren't angry because I had $8 million. They were afraid because they needed it. $8 million wouldn't fix their problems, not really. But it would buy time. Just enough to keep the illusion alive a little longer. That was when the phone rang again. My father. "Caitlin," he said, his voice low, controlled, dangerous in the way it always had been when I was growing up. "I'm not asking anymore. You will be at that meeting tomorrow." "Dad," I said, "Eleanor left that money to me." She built this company, he snapped. You think she would want to see it fail because you're having some rebellious phase? I'm 32. Then it's selfishness, he said. Pure selfishness. You have no idea what's at stake here. He hung up before I could respond. I stared at my screen, at the numbers that told a story no one at that dinner table wanted to hear. The company didn't just want my inheritance, they were counting on it. The irony sat heavy in my chest. For 15 years, I had been invisible to them, too quiet, too different, too unimportant to matter. And now, suddenly, I was essential, not as a daughter, not as family, as a resource. That night my mother called again. This time her voice was soft, practiced, coated in sweetness. Family isn't about keeping score, she said. It's about loyalty. I almost laughed. Is that the loyalty where I'm told I'll never amount to anything? I asked. Or the kind where Jason gets credit for everything and I'm told to sit quietly and smile? Her tone hardened instantly. If you don't bring that money tomorrow, she said, you're out. No more dinners, no more holidays. Jason won't let his kids near you. I ended the call without responding. I sat alone in my office long after the city went dark, the skyline glowing with borrowed light. On my desk, Eleanor's letter rested beside my calendar. Tomorrow at 2 p.m., a family meeting. They thought they were coming to collect what they believed belonged to them. They had no idea what I was bringing with me, and they had no idea how close they already were to losing everything. The boardroom at Moore Construction Group felt colder than it should have, not because of the temperature, but because of how deliberately arranged everything was. My father sat at the head of the table, hands folded, posture rigid with authority. Jason was to his right, relaxed, already convinced this was over. My mother sat to the left, her expression carefully neutral, and lining the far side of the table were three men in identical navy suits, leather briefcases placed in front of them with quiet precision. Lawyers. They hadn't invited me to talk. They had invited me to surrender. Caitlin, my father said without standing. Glad you could make it. I took the seat closest to the door. Old habits die hard. These gentlemen, he continued, gesturing toward the men beside him, are here to help us resolve some confusion regarding your grandmother's estate. One of the lawyers slid a stack of papers toward me. 12 pages, dense, clinical, impersonal. I didn't pick them up. We've prepared everything, the lead attorney said smoothly. All you need to do is sign where indicated, and the funds will be returned to their rightful place. Rightful place? Jason smiled. We're trying to make this easy for you. I glanced at the nameplates on the table. Harrison and Associates? Interesting. I leaned back slightly. You brought lawyers to a family meeting. My father's jaw tightened. This isn't personal. It's business. That was always his favorite excuse. The lawyer continued. We've reviewed the circumstances surrounding the revision of your grandmother's will. Given her age and medical condition, there are clear indicators of undue influence. Undue influence. I kept my voice steady. I visited Eleanor twice a month. Where were you? Jason leaned forward. Convenient timing, isn't it? Right when she was vulnerable. Another lawyer opened his briefcase and pulled out additional documents. We have statements from her caregivers noting confusion in her final weeks. One caregiver, I corrected quietly, who was later fired for stealing medication. The room shifted. My father slammed his hand lightly against the table. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. We are prepared to file a formal challenge, the lead attorney said, his tone sharpening. Public proceedings, media attention, your name attached to accusations of manipulation. Jason smirked. Seattle loves a good scandal. My mother finally spoke, her voice soft and practiced. We don't want that for you, sweetheart. Just sign the papers. A pen was placed beside the documents. You have 72 hours, the lawyer said. After that, we file. The reputational damage will be significant. 72 hours. I looked around the table, at the lawyers with their rehearsed intimidation, at my parents with their emotional leverage. At Jason, already calculating how far $8 million would stretch. For once in your life, he said, do the right thing for this family. I stood. 72 hours? I asked. That's generous, the lawyer replied. It is, I said calmly. See you at the summit. My father's face flushed red. Sit down. We're not finished. You are, I said. I'm not. I moved toward the door. You walk out now, my father called after me. And you're done. No inheritance, no family. Jason's kids won't even know your name. I stopped, my hand on the doorknob. I need time to think, I said. 72 hours. Relief flickered across his face. He thought I was wavering. Jason couldn't resist one last jab. Bring the checkbook to the summit. We'll make it easy. My father nodded. A united front. They were already planning how to use my money. Bridge funding, equipment purchases, another lie to keep the machine moving. None of them noticed the text I sent before leaving the room. None of them saw the reply that came through moments later. See you at the summit. Everything's prepared. As I stepped into the elevator, Jason laughed behind me. She'll cave, she always does. The doors closed. I exhaled for the first time in an hour. They thought the deadline was a threat. They thought the lawyers were the weapon. They thought I was cornered. What they didn't understand, what they had never bothered to learn, was that desperation always reveals itself to those who know how to read it. 72 hours. That wasn't my countdown. It was theirs. And when the doors opened onto the street below, the city moving on without any idea of the collapse quietly approaching, I realized something with startling clarity. They didn't bring lawyers because they were confident. They brought lawyers because they were terrified. And terror, when exposed at the wrong moment, has a way of turning power into liability. I walked away from the building without looking back. The ambush was over, the stage was set, and the next time we met, it wouldn't be behind closed doors. I didn't go home after the meeting. I went back to my office, closed the door, and pulled the blinds halfway down, not to shut the world out, but to narrow my focus. The city outside kept moving, unaware that a company that had shaped half its skyline was days away from collapse. More construction group was running out of time. I opened the financial dashboards I'd been tracking quietly for years, public filings on one screen, internal projections on another, payment schedules, penalty clauses, credit covenants, pieces of a puzzle my family never realized I'd been assembling. Harbor Point Tower sat at the center of it all, Jason's crown jewel, 40 floors of glass and steel on some of the most expensive land in Seattle. The project that was supposed to cement his legacy and prove, once and for all, that he was the natural successor. What the glossy presentations didn't show was the shortfall. They had underbid the project by nearly $30 million. Not because of bad luck, but because of arrogance. They assumed they'd figure it out later, the way they always had. When costs ballooned, they shuffled money from other projects. When cash dried up, they leaned harder on credit. When lenders hesitated, they promised returns that made no mathematical sense. Classic Moore strategy: build first, solve later, blame someone else when it cracks. I scrolled through subcontractor invoices marked overdue. Permit extensions filed quietly with the city. Penalty fees stacking up. $15,000 a day for missed milestones. 4 separate liens that hadn't hit the news yet, but would soon. They weren't just short on cash. They were bleeding credibility. My phone buzzed. A message from Jason. You don't understand what you're risking. I didn't reply, because I understood exactly what they were risking, better than they did. I opened an email thread from 2 weeks earlier, one my family didn't know existed. A loan application forwarded to me, flagged urgent and confidential. Moore Construction Group, Harbor Point Tower. Requested amount, $150 million. They needed that money by November 20th, 10 days. Without it, the project would default. And once that happened, the city would have grounds to audit their other contracts. Patterns would emerge. Underbidding, Delayed payments. Misrepresented progress. The dominoes were already lined up. I leaned back in my chair and let the weight of it settle. For the first time since Eleanor's death, something close to anger surfaced, not loud, not explosive, but sharp and focused. They hadn't come after my inheritance because they believed it was rightfully theirs. They came after it because they were desperate, and desperation makes people sloppy. My father's words echoed in my head. You have no idea what's at stake here. He was wrong. I knew exactly what was at stake. I also knew something else. Something that changed the way the room at that family meeting suddenly made sense. They hadn't just brought lawyers to intimidate me. They had brought lawyers because time was against them. 72 hours wasn't a legal courtesy. It was a stall. A way to buy just enough space to make it to the Northwest Development Summit without the truth spilling out first. That summit was their last play. 500 investors, developers, lenders, press, a stage big enough to sell confidence and drown out doubt, if you could control the narrative. I pulled up the summit agenda. More construction was scheduled for a prime slot. My father would stand under bright lights, wearing a tailored suit, and announce that Harbor Point Tower was fully funded. A lie. A dangerous one. Because in that room, fully funded didn't mean optimistic. It meant signed contracts, money committed, capital transferred. If anyone questioned him publicly, and the industry was full of people who knew how to read between the lines, the entire facade could collapse in real time. Unless someone stepped in, unless someone with actual capital stood behind the promise. That's when the irony hit me with full force. They thought my $8 million was the solution. It wasn't even close. $8 million might have bought them a few weeks, maybe a month, enough to quiet one lender and delay one penalty. But $150 million? That was control. That was survival. And I was closer to that money than they could ever imagine. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the skyline, buildings Jason liked to claim as proof of his importance. I knew which ones more construction had actually delivered on time. I also knew which ones had quietly gone over budget and been propped up by last-minute maneuvers. My phone rang. My mother again. "Caitlin," she said, her voice tired now, the polish beginning to crack. "Your father's under a lot of pressure." I almost told her the truth. Almost told her that pressure didn't come from me. It came from years of pretending numbers didn't matter. Instead, I said, "I'm sure he is." "Just think about what you're doing," she pleaded. "This isn't just about money." She was right. It wasn't. It was about power. About who had it, who deserved it, and who had been quietly building it while everyone else was too busy dismissing them. After the call ended, I opened a folder I hadn't touched in a while. Inside were analyses, projections, and notes I'd made over time, not out of revenge, but out of habit. I'd been trained to see patterns, to anticipate risk. More Construction Group had been a risk for a long time. They just didn't know it yet. I closed the folder and checked the date again. 72 hours. They thought they had set the deadline. They were wrong. The real countdown would begin the moment my father stepped onto that summit stage and tried to sell a future he no longer controlled. And when that happened, the power dynamic they'd enforced for decades would finally collapse under its own weight. I turned off the lights, locked my office, and headed into the night. The game had already shifted, they just hadn't felt it yet. The next 48 hours moved with the quiet intensity of a storm forming offshore. No thunder yet, no visible chaos, just pressure building in places most people never bothered to look. On my side of the board, preparation meant silence. I worked late into the night at Apex Capital Partners, my office lit by the glow of spreadsheets and city lights. David Harrison sat across from me in the conference room, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, the Harbor Point Tower files spread between us like evidence. "They're hemorrhaging faster than I thought," he said, tapping the screen. 14 to 15,000 a day in penalties alone, and that's before the subcontractors start talking. "They will," I replied. "Once one speaks, the rest follow." David studied me for a moment. "They still don't know you're involved." They can't, I said. Not yet. We both understood what was at stake. If more construction learned too early where the real leverage sat, they'd pivot, try to contain, try to negotiate behind closed doors. The summit didn't work if anyone had time to regroup. I glanced at the investment committee approval stamped at the top of the file. $150 million. Conditional. Powerful. Silent. Clause 7.3 glowed on the page beneath it. Primary investor retains veto authority over all major financial decisions. Control, written in plain language. David leaned back. Once this goes public, they'll fight. With what leverage? I asked. He smiled thinly. Fair point. While we worked, my phone kept buzzing. Jason, again. Dad says you're being irrational. My mother. Please come early on Friday. Wear something nice. My father. Finally. United Front matters. Don't embarrass us. I didn't reply to any of them. Because on the other side of the board, their preparation looked very different. They were loud, confident, desperate. Jason was already rehearsing his talking points, pacing the living room of my parents' house like a man practicing for a role he'd been cast in years ago. Harbor Point Tower renderings were spread across the dining table, glossy and impressive. Exactly the kind of visuals that distracted from balance sheets. It's solid, he said for the third time that night. Investors don't need details, they need confidence. My father nodded. Confidence sells. My mother hovered nearby, making coffee no one drank, smiling whenever silence threatened to creep in. We just need Caitlin's money to show commitment, Jason continued. Once they see family backing, the rest follows. Family backing. They still thought $8 million was the play. They had no idea how small that number looked from where I sat. Back in my office, David pulled up the summit schedule. More construction had a prime slot, mid-morning, peak attendance, 500 industry leaders in the room, media on standby, cameras rolling. They're going to announce secured funding, he said. They have to, I replied. Anything less and the market smells blood. And if someone challenges them? They'll bluff. David nodded. Your father's good at that. He always has been, I said. That's why this works. The next morning, a draft of a Forbes profile landed in my inbox. 40 under 40. Quietly circulated. Not public yet, but ready. David watched my expression carefully. You sure you want this live before the summit? No, I said. During. Timing mattered. So did contrast. On Friday morning, I arrived at the Seattle Convention Center early. Not to be seen, but to observe. The hall buzzed with energy. Developers shaking hands, investors scanning name badges, reporters setting up cameras. Across the room, I saw my family. My father stood tall, suit pressed, smile practiced. Jason laughed too loudly with a group of potential partners. My mother stayed close, smoothing imaginary creases, playing her role perfectly. They looked united. They looked powerful. They looked like people who believed the future belonged to them by default. Jason spotted me and grinned, walking over with casual confidence. You made it, he said. Good, Dad'll be happy. I'm sure, I replied. He leaned closer. You brought the checkbook, right? I met his eyes, calm. I brought what's needed. He laughed, misunderstanding entirely. That's my sister, always dramatic. As he walked away, David joined me. Low voice, steady. They're selling certainty. And they don't have it, I said. The doors to the main hall opened. People began filing in. The stage lights warmed. The massive screen behind the podium flickered to life with images of Harbor Point Tower, glass, steel, ambition frozen in perfect angles. Somewhere behind the curtain, my father prepared to speak. Somewhere in his pocket, his phone buzzed with calls he wasn't ready to answer. And somewhere between those two realities, the balance of power hovered, waiting for the moment it would finally tip. I took my seat near the back, invisible by design. The game was no longer about money. It was about who controlled the narrative when the lights came on. And in less than an hour, 500 people would learn the difference between confidence and capital. The summit was about to begin. They believed this stage belonged to them. They were wrong. The lights dimmed precisely at 9. A hush rolled through the main hall of the Seattle Convention Center as 500 voices faded into anticipation. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Phones slipped into pockets. Attention moved forward, drawn by the promise of certainty in an industry that rarely offered it. My father stepped onto the stage like a man who had done this his entire life. Because he had. Richard Moore stood tall behind the podium, suit tailored, shoulders squared, the practiced confidence of someone who believed the room belonged to him. Behind him, the massive screen lit up with gleaming renderings of Harbor Point Tower, glass catching sunlight, steel lines cutting into the sky, Seattle's future framed in architectural perfection. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and amplified, "Moore Construction Group isn't just building structures, we're building legacies." Applause followed. Polite, professional, encouraging. Jason stood near the edge of the stage, chest slightly puffed, scanning the crowd like a prince surveying loyal subjects. My mother sat in the front row, posture flawless, hands folded in her lap, smiling the way she always did when the story being told benefited the family. I stayed where I was, near the back, half-shadowed, exactly where no one expected the future to stand. "The Harbor Point Tower project," my father continued, "represents over $200 million in development and 40 stories of innovation." The screen shifted. More images. More promise. "And I'm pleased to announce," he said, pausing just long enough to build suspense, "that funding for Harbor Point Tower is fully secured." The words settled into the room like a declaration. Fully secured. I felt the ripple move through the crowd, investors leaning forward, analysts exchanging glances. In this space, that phrase meant something specific. It meant contracts signed, capital committed, money ready to move. Jason's smile widened. He stepped closer to the stage, already reaching for hands that hadn't yet been offered. "We'll be signing final documents this week," my father added. "Construction acceleration begins Monday." David leaned toward me, voice barely audible. "He's all in." "He has to be," I replied. My father continued, momentum building, each sentence stacking confidence on top of confidence. He talked about timelines, returns, market demand, 30% in 18 months, guaranteed. That earned him a murmur. 30% was ambitious, aggressive, borderline reckless. Sandra Chen from Pacific Development raised a hand. "Mr. Moore," she said, cutting through the rhythm, "who is your primary investor?" A flicker passed across my father's face. Too quick for most to notice. "We'll be announcing that shortly," he said smoothly. "They're here today, actually." "Then bring them up," someone called out. "Let's meet them." Laughter followed, curious, not hostile, yet. Jason glanced toward the wings, then back at the audience. "Our investor prefers privacy," he said quickly. The room shifted again. Privacy was understandable. Vagueness was not. "If funding is secured," Sandra pressed, "why haven't the accelerated permits been filed with the city?" My father's jaw tightened. "Technical formalities," he said. "Everything will be filed Monday." Phones started to appear in hands. People were checking records, running numbers, whispering. David straightened beside me. "They're smelling it." Blood in the water. My father pressed on, trying to regain control. "As I was saying, Moore Construction has a proven history." "Robert," a voice interrupted from the aisle. "3 investors pulled out last week. Is that true?" The room went still. Jason turned sharply, scanning faces, trying to identify the source. My mother's smile froze just slightly. "That's confidential," my father replied, his voice tightening. "Public filings aren't confidential," someone else said. "And there are liens." That did it. The screen behind my father flickered. Not changing content, just enough to draw attention. David stepped forward, not yet onto the stage, but close enough to be noticed. "Perhaps I can help clarify," he said, his voice calm, measured. Heads turned instantly. David Harrison was known in that room, respected. When he spoke, people listened. "David," my father said, forcing a smile. "I didn't realize Apex Capital Partners would be attending." "We never miss the summit," David replied. "Especially when we're involved." Phones lit up again. Search results loaded. Whispers grew louder. "Involved how?" Sandra asked. My father's composure cracked, just barely. "This isn't the time." "When is the time?" David asked. "You have 4 days until default." The word hit like a dropped glass. Default. Jason stepped forward. "That's inappropriate." "What's inappropriate," David said evenly, "is announcing secured funding that doesn't exist." A collective intake of breath rippled through the hall. My father opened his mouth, then closed it. Sweat beaded at his temple. "Unless," David continued, turning slightly, his gaze shifting, not to my father, but toward me in the shadows. "There's something we should all know." 500 sets of eyes followed the movement. I didn't move. Not yet. "Mr. Moore," David said, addressing the stage again. "Perhaps it's time to discuss the terms." "This is not the forum," my father snapped, his authority thinning by the second. "It became the forum the moment you claimed certainty you don't possess," David replied. Jason grabbed my father's arm, whispering urgently. My mother rose halfway from her seat, then sat back down, her face pale. The room buzzed now, phones recording, messages flying, reputations shifting in real time. My father's voice broke through the noise. "We'll address this privately," but there was no private anymore. Not here, not now. And as the crowd leaned forward, sensing something historic unfolding, I finally stood from my seat. Slowly, deliberately. The failed daughter. The invisible one. Walking toward the stage while an empire began to realize it had just lost control of its own story. And the real truth, about funding, about power, about who held it, was seconds away from being spoken aloud. I stepped into the light as the room fell into a strange, suspended silence. For a moment no one spoke, no one laughed, no one clapped. 500 people simply watched as I crossed the aisle and climbed the steps to the stage, slowly, deliberately, as if time itself had stretched to make room for the shift that was already happening. My father stared at me, confusion flickering across his face before settling into irritation. "Caitlin," he said into the microphone, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This isn't appropriate." Jason let out a short laugh, sharp and nervous. "What are you doing up here?" I didn't answer either of them. David turned slightly, handing me the microphone without ceremony, without announcement. The gesture was subtle, but unmistakable. Control had changed hands. "I'm not here to support this announcement," I said, my voice steady as it carried through the hall. "I'm here to correct it." A ripple moved through the crowd. Not shock yet, curiosity. My father recovered just enough to attempt humor. "That's sweet," he said. "But Harbor Point Tower is a $200 million project. This isn't about personal matters." "You're right," I replied calmly. "It's not personal." I turned slightly, letting my gaze sweep the room before landing back on him. "It's about capital." The screen behind us changed, not to renderings, not to timelines, to a clean, minimalist slide bearing a single logo. Apex Capital Partners. Phones came up instantly. My father's breath caught. "What is this?" David stepped forward, his voice calm, precise. "Apex Capital Partners has reviewed Moore Construction Group's request for $150 million in funding." The room erupted into murmurs. 150 million. Jason shook his head, laughing again, louder this time. "This is ridiculous." "She doesn't work for—" David raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Our managing partner," he continued, "has conducted a full review of your company's financial position." My father's face drained of color. Managing partner? He repeated. David turned toward me. Ms. Moore? I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out a single card. Not flashy, not dramatic. I handed it to my father. Caitlin Moore, Managing Partner, Apex Capital Partners. The sound he made wasn't quite a word. Jason stared at the card, then at me. That's impossible, he said. You work in investment management, I finished for him. The thing you like to call imaginary money. The crowd leaned in. This wasn't just business anymore. This was exposure. You're lying, Jason snapped. This is about the inheritance. You're trying to get back at us. I don't need Eleanor's 8 million, I said clearly. I manage over 500 million. I make more in quarterly performance bonuses than you make in a year. Gasps rippled outward like shockwaves. David tapped his tablet. The screen behind us changed again. A professional headshot. My name, my title. A Forbes profile headline slid into view beneath it. 40 under 40. The quiet force behind Seattle's biggest deals. Published 2 months earlier. The room exploded. Phones were no longer discreet. They were raised openly, recording from every angle. Reporters whispered into headsets. Investors stood, craning for a better view. My father swayed slightly, gripping the edge of the podium. How? He managed, the microphone amplifying the disbelief in his voice. Eleanor introduced me to David 5 years ago, I said. She thought I deserved better than being dismissed at your dinner table. Silence followed. Heavy. Absolute. So, I continued, turning back to the audience, let's talk about this investment. Since Moore Construction announced its funding was secured, I'm sure everyone here would like to understand the terms. The screen shifted again. This time, it displayed a contract summary. Apex Capital Partners. Conditional investment amount. $150,000. My father found his voice just enough to protest. This is a stunt. It's not, David said. It's approved, pending final authorization. He paused. Which belongs to her. The realization hit the room all at once. The daughter they had laughed at, the one seated near the kitchen door, the one publicly diminished minutes earlier, she held the pen. Sandra Chen stood. Ms. Moore, she said carefully, are you saying Apex is willing to fund Harbor Point Tower? Yes, I replied. With conditions. My father's head snapped toward me. Conditions? I nodded. Full financial transparency, independent audit, executive restructuring. Jason stepped forward, voice sharp. You can't do this. I can, I said, meeting his eyes. Because without this funding, Moore Construction defaults in 4 days. The word landed again. Default. You announced secured funding that doesn't exist, I continued, my voice calm but carrying. You hid $30 million in shortfalls. You shuffled debt between projects. You told investors everything was on schedule when it wasn't. The room erupted into noise. That's not true, my father shouted, but the conviction was gone. David projected documents onto the screen. Liens, extensions, missed payments, public records, undeniable. This, I said quietly, is why you tried to take my inheritance. You needed proof of capital, leverage, something to survive this moment. Jason lunged toward the podium. David stepped between us effortlessly. You needed 8 million, I continued, to pretend you still had control. What you didn't know was that I already had it. I looked out over the audience. I'm offering $150 million, enough to save this project, enough to save this company. Hope flickered in my father's eyes. But, I added, not without accountability. I let the pause stretch. You demanded my signature behind closed doors, I said. Today, you'll need yours, and the world will be watching. The screen behind us froze on the contract summary. The pen, metaphorical but very real, hovered in the air. And for the first time in his life, my father understood what it felt like to be powerless in public. The silence after the reveal didn't break all at once. It sagged. It settled into the room like weight, pressing down on every breath, every thought. 500 people stood frozen between disbelief and calculation, watching a man who had just lost control of his own stage. My father didn't speak. His mouth opened once, then closed again. The microphone amplified the small, involuntary sound of breath leaving his lungs. His hands gripped the edges of the podium as if it were the only solid thing left in the room. Jason reacted first. "This is insane," he said, stepping forward, his voice sharp, too loud. "This is a setup. You planned this." I didn't answer him. I didn't need to. David took one step closer to the microphone, his tone measured, professional, unemotional in the way that made it more dangerous. "Let's be clear about the situation," he said. "Moore Construction Group requires $150 million within 4 days to avoid default on the Harbor Point Tower project." 4 days. The number hung there, undeniable. My father swallowed. "That's not—" "It is," David said calmly. "And without immediate funding, the penalties alone will trigger a chain reaction. City audits, lender withdrawals, cross defaults on existing contracts." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Phones came up again, this time openly. Reporters leaned forward. Investors exchanged glances that had nothing to do with loyalty. Jason shook his head violently. "You can't do this in public." "You announced certainty in public," I said. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "This is the consequence." My mother stood from her seat, hands trembling. "Caitlin," she said softly, her composure finally cracking. "Please, not like this." I looked at her then, really looked. At the fear behind the polish, at the realization that the old rules weren't working anymore. "There was another way," I said. "You chose this one." David tapped his tablet. The screen behind us shifted again, not to accusations, not to drama, but to numbers. Liens, delayed payments, permit extensions, public records. Sandra Chen rose slowly from her seat. "Robert," she said, her voice carrying clearly, "is this accurate?" My father's shoulders sagged a fraction. "It's complicated," he said. That was the moment the room turned. Complicated was what people said when the truth was worse than silence. Another investor stood. "You told us funding was secured." "I believed it would be," my father replied, desperation creeping in. "You believed," Sandra repeated. "Or you hoped." Jason lunged forward again, anger replacing fear. "This is extortion." "No," David said evenly. "This is leverage." The word landed cleanly. I stepped closer to the podium, close enough that my father could hear me without the microphone. "You demanded my signature in private," I said quietly. "With lawyers, with threats. Now the terms are reversed." He looked at me then, not as a daughter, not as an inconvenience, but as a problem he couldn't overpower. "What do you want?" he asked, barely audible. I turned back to the room. "Apex Capital Partners is prepared to fund Harbor Point Tower," I said. "In full. $150 million. Hope flared. Brief, desperate. "With conditions." The room leaned in. "First," I continued, "a full independent financial audit, complete transparency, no internal handling." Jason opened his mouth to protest. I cut him off with a glance. "Second," I said, "executive restructuring, performance-based, no family immunity." My mother gasped softly. "And third," I added, "all undisclosed liabilities are disclosed immediately, to investors, lenders, and the board." The murmurs grew louder. "This would destroy us," Jason snapped. "No," I said calmly. "What destroyed you was pretending numbers didn't apply to you." My father stared at the contract summary on the screen, his face drained of color. "This is a takeover." "This is survival," I replied. "You taught me the difference." He shook his head slowly, as if trying to wake from a dream. "You're doing this to punish us." I met his eyes. "I'm doing this to stop the damage." David stepped in smoothly. "The alternative," he said, "is default by Monday morning." Silence again. He looked out at the audience, at the people who had believed him minutes earlier, who were now calculating exit strategies, at the cameras, at the phones, at the legacy he'd built on certainty that no longer existed. Jason leaned toward him, whispering urgently, "Don't sign anything." My father didn't respond. Instead, he spoke into the microphone, his voice hoarse. "We need time." David nodded. "You have 72 hours." The number echoed, familiar. I felt the shift then, not triumph, not satisfaction, but something cleaner, control. I stepped back from the podium, letting the weight of the moment settle where it belonged. Behind me, the screen remained frozen on the contract terms, salvation and surrender written in the same ink. The summit buzzed with noise again, but it was different now. No applause, no admiration, just the sound of consequences moving through a crowded room. As I turned to leave the stage, I caught my father's eye one last time. This time, there was no anger in it. Only the realization that the helper's seat had never been empty, it had been waiting. By the time I reached the exit, the summit behind me had dissolved into noise. Questions, accusations, hurried phone calls, reputations unraveling in real time. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Whatever happened next would no longer be decided by applause or denial. It would be decided by deadlines. 3 hours later, the footage was everywhere. Clips of the stage, screenshots of the contract terms, headlines that tried and failed to sound neutral. More construction stock slid in after hours trading. Investors pulled out. The board called an emergency meeting before sunset. David found me in my office just after dusk, a stack of updates on his tablet. "The board suspended Jason," he said quietly, "pending investigation." I nodded once. "They also found expenses they can't explain," he added. "Personal travel, entertainment, things that don't look good when cameras are rolling." I didn't smile, I didn't celebrate. Exposure isn't victory, it's consequence. My phone buzzed again and again. Reporters, investors, old acquaintances who had never bothered to learn what I did for a living, suddenly eager to congratulate me. I ignored all of it. The only call I answered was from my mother. Her voice was hollow. "Your father hasn't eaten. He won't leave his office." "I'm sorry," I said. And I meant it, not as an apology, but as an acknowledgement of reality. "We could lose the house," she whispered. "The house is in your name," I replied gently. "You're protected." There was a pause. "How did you know that?" "I've known the numbers for years," I said. "I just wasn't allowed to speak them." The deadline arrived with cruel efficiency. On the third morning, before the market opened, my father called. His voice sounded older than it ever had, older than the man who once filled rooms with certainty. "I was wrong," he said. "About you. About what matters." I let the silence stretch, not to punish him, but to give the words their weight. "The board gave me an ultimatum," he continued. "Accept your terms or step aside." "And?" I asked. "I accept," he said. "All of it. The audit, the restructuring, Jason's removal, the disclosure." A long breath. "And the apology. Public. On record." Victory should have tasted sweeter. It didn't. It felt necessary. The press conference was held at noon. Cameras lined the room. Statements were read. Responsibility was acknowledged. Funding documents were signed on stage. $150 million transferred with a click that echoed louder than any applause. More construction groups survived, but it didn't belong to him anymore. Within weeks, a new CEO was installed, external, experienced, unconnected to the family hierarchy. Oversight was formalized. Every major decision required approval. Every number was audited. The empire endured, stripped of ego and rebuilt on accountability. Jason left Seattle quietly. No severance. No safety net. Just the consequences of believing the rules didn't apply to him. Months later, he called, not to apologize, not yet, but to ask for advice. Real advice. The kind that comes without shortcuts. I gave it. Not as forgiveness, as boundary. The $8 million Eleanor left me never moved an inch. Instead, I used it to establish the Eleanor Moore Foundation, scholarships for women entering finance and construction, especially those whose families told them they didn't belong. Eleanor would have appreciated the symmetry. 6 months later, I attended my first board meeting as oversight partner. My father sat at the far end of the table, closest to the door, the helper's seat. I slid the projections back toward the new CFO. Too optimistic, I said calmly. Revise. Yes, Ms. Moore, she replied. My father said nothing. He didn't need to, he had learned. Family dinners changed after that. Fewer expectations, clear rules, no comparisons, no dismissive jokes. Respect wasn't implied anymore, it was required. The conversations were awkward at first, then ordinary, then occasionally almost warm. The damage wasn't erased. 15 years doesn't vanish because a contract was signed. But something stable replaced something cruel. And that was enough. A year later, Apex Capital Partners crossed $1 billion in assets under management. Moore Construction's turnaround became a case study. I was invited to speak about governance, power, and the cost of underestimation. The greatest liability in business, I told the room, isn't debt or competition. It's assuming yesterday's hierarchy will hold tomorrow. It's mistaking silence for weakness. On the day Harbor Point Tower finally opened, my father stood in the crowd, not on stage, not at the podium, just another observer. He caught my eye and nodded, not the old nod, something closer to respect. I nodded back. Success, I learned, isn't proving someone wrong in public. It's setting boundaries in private and having them honored. It's choosing control over approval, clarity over noise, sovereignty over survival. If you've ever been underestimated, remember this: your value doesn't decrease because someone refuses to see it. Sometimes the quietest seat holds the most leverage. If this story resonated with you, like the video, subscribe for more stories about reclaiming power, and share it with someone who needs the reminder. Comment below. Where are you watching from? And what boundary did you have to set to protect yourself? I read every comment. And I'll see you in the next story.